Mount Everest, a massive three-sided pyramid of intimidating rock. It towers above all of its neighbors in the Himalayas. It is the highest point on Earth. Climbing it has become the ultimate test of man's strength, endurance, and willpower. For the haunting fact remains, for every 5 people who make it to the top, one dies trying.
The cold that you feel is unlike cold that you feel anywhere else. The cold comes right from the core of your body.
I'm addicted to it. I love that mountain.
In the half hour before I staggered into camp, I would say I was over 99% absolutely certain that I was dead.
Just another day on the roof of the world. Mount Everest reaches 5.5 miles into the sky. Many commercial airliners don't even fly at that extreme altitude. Standing boldly at 29,028 feet, it is the roof of the world, the closest place to the stars. It is located right on the border of the countries of Tibet, a Chinese-occupied region which is to the north, and Nepal, which lies to its south. Ever since the first attempt to climb Mount Everest in 1921, hundreds have traveled from around the world and dared to challenge it. Men, women, doctors, teachers, mothers, fathers, people from all walks of life. Everest, known as Chamalungma, goddess, mother of the world, has mass appeal. For some, it's an addiction.
I've been there 9 times. I've spent 3 years of time standing on that mountain. It's 10% of my life. It's 20% of my adult life has been spent on that mountain. To leave it, it's a loss of identity for me.
The reality is that climbing Everest is a very risky endeavor. As of mid-1997, 700 climbers had summited Everest, but not all lived to tell about it. In its history, Everest has taken 150 lives. One dies for every 5 who make it to the top. And the death bell still tolls. The British began the process of locating the world's highest mountain in the early 1800s. By 1856, surveyors had determined that Peak 15, now known as Mount Everest, was the tallest. Peak 15 was renamed Mount Everest in honor of Sir George Everest, the Surveyor General of India from 1830 to 1843. Sir Everest, convinced that mountains should be known by their local names, was reluctant to have the mountain named after him.
Everest himself was a modest man and didn't really like to set the precedent for that. He also had the idea that Everest was unpronounceable to the locals. He didn't think they could get their tongue round a Western name like that. He proved to be wrong because they all say it perfectly well now.
By 1885, this man, Clinton Dent, a surgeon and mountaineer, was the first to raise the question of climbing Mount Everest. He had studied the effects of altitude on balloonists and was convinced that it was humanly possible to reach the peak of Everest. Almost 40 years later, George Mallory, a war veteran and former schoolmaster, took the challenge. Disillusioned with life as a teacher, Mallory became one of the members of a British reconnaissance expedition in April 1921. They dared to attempt the seemingly impossible.
George Lee Mallory was really the pioneer of Everest. He was the one who really decided on the route up the north side. He was the one who put in the push towards the summit.
And so, with 7 of his comrades, Mallory set out to conquer Everest. The expedition attacked Everest from the Tibetan or northern side. Under the leadership of the 13th Dalai Lama in 1911, strict policies were relaxed, allowing climbing expeditions into the country. Due to political frictions, Nepal, on the other hand, remained off-limits to foreigners until 1946. For 3 months, Mallory's team looked for a route, pushing their way through the unexplored precipices of Everest while battling the fierce wind and intense cold. It's astounding they did not freeze to death. While Mallory and the rest of the expedition relied on a lot less to keep warm, they relied heavily on the help of Sherpas, the mountain people indigenous to the Everest region. The Sherpas carried supplies and helped the group set up camps on the mountain. They would become essential to the Everest experience. By September 24, 1921, Mallory had managed to pioneer a route to the North Col, located at about 22,000 feet. 5 days later, in a letter to his wife Ruth, Mallory wrote, "I carried the whole party on my shoulders to the end, and we were turned back in a wind in which no man could live an hour. As it is, we have established the way to the summit for anyone who cares to try the highest adventure." The following year, in 1922, Mallory himself took on the challenge as he set out on his second expedition. At one point, he saved the lives of 3 of his climbing partners, Henry Morshead, Edward Norton, and Howard Somervell, before they slid down the mountain. 2 other members in Mallory's group, George Finch and Jeffrey Bruce, managed to ascend to 25,500 feet. They were the first to test the group's primitive oxygen equipment and demonstrate the need for it at such high altitudes. According to Finch, the oxygen saved their lives. The 2 men advanced about 2,000 feet more before being forced to turn back due to frostbite and extreme exhaustion. Nevertheless, they had reached a record height of 27,300 feet. Mallory was relentless in his pursuit of Everest. When asked why he climbed it, he simply said, "Because it is there." But Mallory was not to triumph this time around. Then in 1924, Mallory went on his 3rd expedition. During this trek, the group made 3 different summit attempts. This picture shows the second attempt by Edward Norton. 2 years earlier, Norton had almost plummeted to his death. Now he had climbed to 28,000 feet, just 1,000 feet shy of the summit. Then Mallory, along with his partner Andrew Irvin, assaulted Chomolungma in the final and 3rd attempt. On June 8th, the 2 were seen by fellow climber Noel Odell, who took this photo, the last one of them alive. Odell said they vanished behind some passing clouds.
All we really know is that Noel Odell believes he saw them at a height of 27,000 feet, still making their way upward. And later on, an ice axe was found, one of their ice axes, which could not have fallen from much over 27,000 feet. So the only real evidence we have is that they probably had reached 27,000 feet. What happened beyond that, I don't think anyone will ever know.
What is certain is that George Mallory's name will forever be linked with Mount Everest.
My approach to the climb of Everest, certainly wasn't confident that I would be successful. It was that we would give it everything we had, we'd tackle it with all enthusiasm and use our skill and energy, and hopefully we might get to the summit.
Edmund Hillary was born in Auckland, New Zealand. The son of a commercial beekeeper, he also took up the profession. But on weekends, he was an avid mountain climber. His first summit in 1940 was Mount Olivier, a small peak in New Zealand. 13 years later, he found himself on a British expedition team in pursuit of Everest, the tallest place on Earth.
Ed Hillary learned to climb and took up climbing in New Zealand. And the thing about New Zealand climbing is it's a very tough country to get to the mountains. You have to be a very resourceful climber and you have to be very strong.
30 years had passed since Mallory and Urban tried to conquer Everest. In that time, the British had tried 4 times in the 1930s without success. In the 40s, World War II left little time to worry about climbing mountains. Then, in 1953, the Brits felt it was time to tackle Everest once again. This time, the expedition headed by Colonel John Hunt assaulted the mountain from the south or Nepalese side. China had closed Tibet's border after World War II. Before leaving for Nepal, extensive preparations had to be made. Scientists tested and retested oxygen equipment, researched materials for clothing, and designed the warmest footwear. All of the equipment for the 1953 expedition, including food, medical supplies, and tents, weighed 15 tons. It all had to be transported. There were roads inside Nepal, but none into it, so the equipment was carried by cable railway. The expedition's journey to the base of Everest began from the capital of Nepal, Kathmandu, known as the City of Temples. It is cut off from the world by mountains. From here, over 350 porters and Sherpas carried the supplies and equipment. It would be a long, arduous journey to get to the foot of Everest, where base camp would be established. Climbers and Sherpas would all travel 175 miles over unsafe, rickety bridges and rugged terrain in their quest to reach the pinnacle of Everest. Breathing would become difficult. Hillary and the others practiced with their oxygen equipment. Kathmandu, where they had started, was situated 4,000 feet above sea level. The base of Everest, where they were headed, was about 18,000 feet. The Sherpas, who are born along the mountains, are naturally used to the thin air. The climbers were not. According to Dr. Robert Cheney, a physiologist, probably no one fully adapts on Mount Everest.
That's too high to adapt properly. I think that most people feel that humans can adapt and live permanently at, say, 18,000 feet, 17,000 feet maximum. Once you're above there, the body has ongoing adaptations, the breathing response, the blood response, the tissue response. I think there's an ongoing process, at which point then the body starts to deteriorate. And adaptation, although on the one hand is ongoing, the body is wasting away.
Once at base camp, the climbers allowed their bodies to acclimatize gradually.
We had a program of 2 weeks in which we climbed up to 20,000 feet and then descended down and slept at lower levels. We knew by that stage that psychologically that it was very much better to climb high and sleep low. So after that 2 weeks, I was pretty well acclimatized.
The life of a mountaineer on Everest is an up and down process. They must set up campsites every couple of thousand feet and retreat to lower altitudes to allow the body to recover. Some describe the process as building a pyramid.
Your lower camps are established with more tents and supplies, and then as you work your way up, the higher camps are smaller and not as well established. So as you go higher, you're obviously, when you go into high camp, you're just taking the bare minimum.
Ultimately, Hillary's expedition would set up 9 campsites along the southern route. Base camp would be at the foot of Kumbo Icefall at 17,900 feet. Camp 2 would be set up almost 2,000 feet later, and Camp 3 at the top of the icefall would rest at 20,200 feet. Camp 4 would be situated in the area known as the Western Coombe, and then Camps 5 through 7 would be interspersed about 1,000 feet apart. Then, at 26,000 feet came Camp 8, and the final Camp 9 would rest at 27,900 feet. The first obstacle for Hillary and his teammates to overcome was the ominous and threatening Kumbo Icefall. Over the years, it has become the most dangerous feature of Everest. More people have lost their lives here than at any other place on the mountain.
Basically, it's a glacier that we've measured it to move 4 or 5 feet a day. It's huge towers of ice that have all broken up. It's a glacier that has reached a steep area, breaks up, and leaves towers of ice everywhere, 60, 80, 100 feet tall. And these towers are moving downhill and collapsing all the time and forming new crevasses, and crevasses open and close.
As they plowed their way through the treacherous icefall, they adjusted ropes for climbing, secured logs to cross the monstrous crevasses, and got ladders ready. Meanwhile, the Sherpas carried loads up the route. It took them nearly 3 weeks to pave the way for the rest of the expedition and find a location for Camp 3. Beyond the Kumbo Icefall loomed the Western Coombe, which Mallory had named, and the Lodesea Face. Navigating through these sections in the snow, ice, and hurricane winds proved to be almost as grueling and painstaking as their trek through the icefall. Camps 4 through 7 were installed in these regions. The higher up they went, the harder it was to breathe, although Hillary handled the altitudes better than his fellow climbers.
I found that whereas a lot of other people, when they were climbing at these high altitudes, would pant and puff like crazy and would frequently have to stop to get their breath back, I seem to be able to just keep going steadily along without those problems.
Reaching the South Col, situated at approximately 26,000 feet, was a turning point for the expedition. This was their site for Camp 8. They were now ready to attack the summit. It was now Hillary's turn. He had been paired with the Sherpa Tenzing Norgay. It was about 6:30 in the morning on May 29th when Hillary and Tenzing set out to make mountaineering history. A couple of hours later, the summit still seemed beyond their reach.
Well, I cut round the back of one ridge and round the back of another ridge, and the summit never seemed to be coming any closer. But finally, I cut round the back of another one and saw that the ridge ahead dropped steeply away. So I looked up, and there was a little rounded cone above us, and I knew it was the summit.
Just before noon, Hillary and Tenzing reached the highest point on Earth, a feat that had eluded mankind for over 30 years. Tenzing stood triumphantly as Hillary snapped his picture.
The main thing I felt was to get a shot of him on top and then to take photographs down all the leading ridges of the mountain to show absolutely for certain that we got there. I suppose it would have been nice in retrospect to have had a picture of me on top, but I certainly didn't worry about it at the time.
For Americans, the 1960s marked an era of political upheaval over a war that many didn't comprehend. It was the age of rock and roll, a time of national mourning over the loss of a president, an age of adventurism as the American space program tinkered with the possibility of the first man on the moon. But before Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, there was another group of Americans who shared in the spirit of adventure. They set out to reach the top of the world, not in a rocket, but by foot.
I think that our climb is certainly one of the historical moments in Everest history. It wasn't planned that way. We were just there for the adventure and a good challenge. It's taken on a place in the evolution of high mountaineering.
Dr. Thomas Hornbein was one of 20 members that made up the American team that wished to reach the highest point on Earth in 1963. The expedition headed by Norman Deerenfurth had lofty aspirations. They wanted to assault Everest not by one, but two different routes. One was to reach the summit using the South Col route, which Hillary successfully used. The other was to find a new route via the unknown West Ridge and descend from the South Col, making it the first traverse of Everest. Hornbein, a physician, was dedicated to pursuing Everest from the unexplored West Ridge.
The possibility, small though it might be, of being able to reach the summit by this unknown, over this unknown terrain, was, I think, what captivated us.
Originally, the plan had called for the climbers to reach the summit via the South Col and then descend via the unexplored West Ridge. But Hornbein and fellow climbers Willie Unsold and Dick Emerson were opposed to the idea.
We thought it might be suicide to get to the top of Everest and then plunge down an unknown way with no support system below. Didn't seem too appetizing. So several of us came up with the idea that maybe we could climb up the West Ridge and then traverse down the regular way, which really was the fantasy.
The group departed from Kathmandu in February and immediately suffered a series of setbacks. A bridge collapsed, sending many of the Sherpas, the mountain people who helped the climbers with their loads, into a rushing river. None of the Sherpas could swim. Fortunately, they were all pulled out, and although some were badly bruised, no one died. A lot of the equipment was recovered. A month later, another accident, this one fatal. Trying to secure a route through the notorious Khumbu icefall, team member Jake Breitenbach was swallowed by an avalanche.
At first, our reaction was that, climbing isn't worth sacrificing lives. I think that certainly I, and I suspect many others, had the feeling, let's bag it and go home. And then maybe it's a rationalization, but you realize that the last thing Jake would want have happen is that we would turn around and not continue as a consequence of his death.
It was back to the task at hand, establishing a path over the deadly icefall. According to Hornbein, climbing over the insidious crevasses was all in a day's work. Attacking Everest from two different routes was an exciting and historic proposition. Yet, in a way, it divided the expedition into two separate camps, the South Col team and the West Ridge team.
We stayed pretty civil, actually, in spite of the potential stresses of competing between these two routes and trying to balance the resources of supply and material and carrying power of Sherpas.
Deerenfurth determined that the South Col team would try to summit Everest first. Despite the underlying competition, the West Ridge group realized that putting the first American on the top of the world was the group's top priority. Using the known South Col route increased their chances. The West Ridgers would have to wait their turn. By the end of April, Jim Whittaker and Sherpa Nawangambu of the South Cull Group were ready to make their push towards the summit. Finally, on April 30th, Jim Whittaker and Sherpa Nawangambu reached Camp 6 at 27,500 feet. Whittaker radioed base camp.
Everything's fine. We're up here at 6. We're fine. We're leaving for the summit tomorrow. Wish us luck. This is Camp 6.
The next day, May 1st, Whittaker and Nawangambu set out to conquer Everest. At 1 p.m., the summit was theirs. Whittaker triumphantly planted the American flag and took a picture of Nawangambu.
Willie and I happened to be down at base camp at the time that Jim summited, and we were really anxious because we knew that our opportunity to go back up and have at the West Ridge was very dependent on a successful ascent. And so we were elated when Jim and Nawangambu came down and they had pulled it off, because now it meant that it was our turn.
Hornbein and Unsold trudged through a massive gully, now known as the Hornbein Couloir, which cut through the yellow band. At one point, they had climbed 400 feet in 4 hours. It was exasperatingly slow progress. But they had gone too far to turn back. Several hours later, they reached the summit. There to greet them was the American flag Whittaker had left 3 weeks before. It was May 22nd. Having descended the South Cull, Hornbein and Unsold had completed the first traverse of Everest. It wasn't without sacrifice. Both Unsold and another climber, Barry Bishop, suffered from frostbite and lost their toes. It was 1963. The Americans had earned themselves a special place in the annals of Mount Everest. Before 1978, all climbers who had crested Everest had done it with the aid of supplemental oxygen. Then came Italian Reinhold Messner and his Austrian partner Peter Habler. They were determined to climb without it. For them, it would strictly be man against the mountain.
If I put some technical equipment, some important technical thing between me and the mountains, I have never the possibility to know myself.
Naturally, there were people who told us, well, you're crazy, you're idiots, you can't make it.
On May 8, 1978, Messner and Habler left the South Cull, situated at approximately 26,000 feet, and pressed for the tip of the world. They took 40 steps at a time and rested. By the time they reached the Hillary step just below the summit, Habler could not feel his arms, but he had gotten too far to turn back. He dragged himself to the summit, while Messner captured the moment on film.
All I remember, I started crying. I cried like a little child, you know. I fell over him.
Not only had they reached the peak without oxygen, but they had done it in record time, 8 hours. On average, climbers who use oxygen take 12 hours to reach the summit from their last camp.
What they have is tremendous physical capabilities, physiology that they were born with, and a competitive spirit and wisdom in the mountains that supersedes most other people. It's just an incredible feat of endurance, compounded by experience. It fooled many of the physiologists and set a new standard, like the 4-minute mile.
In some ways, the events that took place on the way down were even more dramatic than the ascent. Messner, too tired to descend any other way, sat and slid down the mountain back to the South Cull. He also suffered from snow blindness and couldn't see. He had taken off his goggles one too many times during the trip and was in excruciating pain. Messner's vision returned shortly after. In 1980, Messner returned to Everest to repeat his feat, only this time, incredibly, he'd do it alone. In 1975, Junko Tabei, a 35-year-old mother from Japan, became the first woman and 39th person to summit Mount Everest. Less than a decade later, in 1982, Marty Hoey wanted to become the first American woman to succeed.
I hope to be the first American female to climb Everest. I hope that I'm strong enough to even have the chance, and when it presents itself, I will hopefully be ready.
It didn't take long for Marty to become passionate about climbing. She became a guide, leading climbers to the top of Mount Rainier, which stands at over 14,000 feet, half as tall as Mount Everest. 10 years after she had started as a cabin girl, she was considered one of the foremost climbers in the United States. Although she complained about how demanding the work was, she told her mother she wouldn't have it any other way.
Every time she went on an expedition, she said, she'd come home and say, I don't know why I do this. It's killing me. I'm so sore, and I hurt, and it's cold, and I really don't know why I do it. But when there was a chance, she went again.
Marty's biggest opportunity came in 1982 when her boss, Lou Whitaker, asked her to join an expedition climbing Mount Everest. It was her chance to become the first American woman to do it.
I think it's the challenge of it. You're continually putting yourself in a situation where you maybe have to call on, a lot of other qualities that you can't read about in books, and that you can't go to school for, that you can't really train for. You're dealing with very basic things. It's one foot in front of the other, and you either are capable of doing that or you aren't. I think that if I am physically and mentally prepared, that I'll have a chance.
The team approached Everest from the north side via an untested route. The trip to base camp started out from Lhasa, the capital of Tibet. In a bold move, the team decided not to use Sherpas. Once at base camp, they would have to lug their own equipment up and down the mountain themselves. They would be only the second expedition in the history of Everest to do this. Eric Simonson, now a veteran of Mount Everest, recalls his first experience on the mountain in 1982 as a part of the team.
God, that was a hard trip. That was probably physically the hardest trip of any of the 5 trips. Was that 1982 trip. We didn't have any Sherpa support. None of us had been there before. Basically, we went at the mountain, I think, too hard. We were very competitive amongst each other. We didn't take rest days. We pushed.
Unable to rely on information from previous expeditions, the team had to plot their own course and the position of their high camps entirely on their own. By mid-April, they had established 3 of 6 camps. Life on the mountain was barely tolerable.
At exceptional altitude, the cold that you feel is unlike cold that you feel anywhere else. The cold comes right from the core of your body. You just can't move fast enough to work up a head of steam, so you're wearing all these clothes, but you're climbing so slowly that you're not generating any warmth.
Finally, the 6th camp was in place. The push for the summit was on. Marty was on her way to becoming the first American woman on Everest.
Marty was a member of the first summit team on that trip. Her and Wickwire and Nielsen and Dave Mayer were pushing to get into the high camp at over 26,000 in the Great Couloir.
Functioning at this altitude is really rough. Thinking is foggy. You're so cold, You can't even feel your fingers or toes. At one point, the climbers ahead of Marty and Jim Wickwire needed more rope to secure the route to Camp 6.
We discussed who would take it up, and Marty said, well, you probably go faster and they need it right away. Why don't you take the rope up? And I had my pack off, and the pack was also attached to the fixed rope. And in order to get my pack on, I had to unclip it. And just as I was beginning to move to put my pack on, Marty said, let me get out of your way. And she stepped to one side.
It proved to be a fatal step. This is the last footage of Marty alive.
I heard this pinging sound and looked up and could see that she was falling backwards down the slope. I could only watch in horror as she slid at an ever-increasing rate of speed down the 45-degree slope. And about 2,000 feet down is an enormous ice cliff. Although I could not see her go over that ice cliff, I was certain that she did with the speed she was traveling.
Marty's waist harness apparently failed, because it had been buckled incorrectly, which is just a example of how a very competent climber can make a small mistake, which wrong time, wrong place.
The only evidence that Marty was ever on the mountain was her harness, which came off when she fell. After Marty's death, several climbers, including Eric Simonson, continued with their quest to the summit. In the end, no one made it to the top in 1982.
You spend 3 months of your life, travel halfway around the world, play havoc with your health, lose maybe one of the best friends you've ever had, and you can't help eventually but sit down at some time and contemplate, was it worth it? Would I do it again? I guess most people would just plumb say you're crazy. I think all of us would do it again, without much hesitation at all. The price was a big one to pay, but anybody that's had the opportunity to climb in a range like the Himalaya has got an idea what I'm talking about when I say there's just nothing like being up there. I know Marty'd come back if she had the opportunity.
Marty's mother knows this is true, and she's finally at peace with Marty's death.
About 2 or 3 years ago, I had this dream. Woke up knowing it was, still remembering it. It was she walking into a village in Tibet, smiling, laughing, having a wonderful time. And I thought, that's it. It's over. She's okay.
6 years after Marty Hoey's death, Stacy Allison became the first American woman to conquer Everest. By the 1990s, reaching the top of the world had become big business. People paid $65,000 and up to buy a spot on a commercial expedition. It was the going price to become a client or customer and experience the ultimate adventure. Some have harsh criticism over the commercialization of Everest.
Instead of you having a team which is experienced and strongly motivated, you have a couple of good climbers who are conducting a bunch of no-hopers, really, who have no or little or no experience, but just want to be able to stand on top and go home and boast about it.
But who is to say who is qualified?
I guess qualified is the key word there, and according to whom? What qualifies you? The ability to write a check? the ability to do the physical effort. I mean, who's the judge of that?
Guide Eric Simonson has been climbing for over 25 years. In 1982, he made an unsuccessful bid to summit Everest. 5 years later, he suffered a stroke on the mountain, which left the right side of his body numb for 2 years. Even so, he returned to Everest in 1991 to guide one of the earliest commercial expeditions. 10 members of his team made it to the summit, including himself. Unfortunately, not all commercial expeditions are successful. Probably the most tragic and infamous chapter in Everest history occurred in the spring of 1996. It was May 10th. The mountain was a flurry of activity with over 30 climbers scattered about, all with one goal: to summit Everest. Among the groups were 2 private expeditions led by seasoned guides, Scott Fisher, an American, and Rob Hall from New Zealand. The climbers in their groups included journalist John Krakauer, postal employee Doug Hansen, socialite Sandy Hill Pittman, and physician Beck Weathers. Weeks earlier, all the climbers had safely navigated some of the most treacherous stretches of Everest, including the Khumbu Icefall, where Scott Fisher paused long enough to have his picture taken. Now the groups were in the home stretch. There was no reason to suspect danger on that day in May. The sky was blue, the route in good condition. There were, however, some delays. With so many climbers on the mountain, there was a bottleneck at the Hillary Step. As the climbers waited, Scott Fisher snapped this picture. It was about 2 p.m. Wispy clouds were starting to roll in. Within 2 hours, another picture from Fisher's camera reveals a dark sky. Soon after, a raging blizzard hit that became a whiteout with visibility of only about 2 feet. A small group, including Sandy Pittman and Beck Weathers, were blown off course. Exhausted and confused, they huddled together in darkness while 50-mile-per-hour winds battered their bodies. Ironically, they were but 600 feet away from camp. Although several of the climbers with Beck Weathers were eventually rescued, he was left for dead on the mountain. But in a miraculous show of strength and the sheer will to live, Weathers refused to give up. Todd Burleson, who participated in the rescue effort, recalls the moment he was standing in camp and a ghostly figure came staggering toward him.
I just couldn't believe what I saw. This man had no face. His face was completely black, solid black from here to here, like he had a crust over him. And his jacket was unzipped down to his waist, full of snow. His arm was bare. There was just bare skin. His jacket had been pulled up to here, and his arm was frozen over his head. We could not lower his arms. He had to walk with his arm frozen like this. And it was just, it looked like marble, white stone. It was just, there was no blood in it.
In the half hour before I staggered into camp, I would say I was over 99% absolutely certain that I was dead. I was still walking, and I knew I had an hour, maybe an hour and a half, if I were really strong, before I gave out and my knees just wouldn't go anymore.
Weathers lost part of his arm, all the fingers on his left hand, and his nose to frostbite. Rob Hall and Scott Fisher both perished on the mountain while trying to usher their other clients to safety. In that one day on Everest, 8 people lost their lives. The tragedy has fueled controversy surrounding the commercialization of Everest. Could this tragedy have been prevented? Are all the people climbing Everest experienced enough? Is the mountain overcrowded? And what should the client-guide relationship be?
A guide needs to be relatively close to you, to stay with you, to keep his eye on you, to see how well you're performing, how well you're behaving. And I think that though one should never Monday morning quarterback somebody else's expedition. The stories one reads about the 96 disaster seem to indicate that the guides were quite often a long, long way away from their clients.
While most outsiders consider the $65,000 price tag for a guided climb of Everest exorbitant, some climbers, like Leslie Buckland, believe it is a sound investment. A 68-year-old grandfather, Buckland climbed to 24,000 feet. Even though he didn't make it to the summit, he has no regrets.
Disappointment is what happens when someone promises you something and they don't deliver. I was never promised the summit of Everest. I wanted to be on that mountain and get as high as I could and come down alive for my darling Barbara, for my children, and for all the other mountains around the world.
It doesn't seem like man's desire to reach the highest point on Earth will diminish anytime soon. The thrill of adventure and conquest is embedded in our culture. Years of exploration has just made it easier to get there.
It was inevitable that what is happening on Everest would happen. And pragmatically, their guiding on Everest will continue. It will not be a wilderness experience anymore.
There appears to be no end to the controversy. But the fact remains, ever since man has first shown a willingness to climb Everest, he has also shown a willingness to die in the attempt. That truth is reflected in the stories of Mallory, Hoey, Fisher, Hall, and the more than 150 people who have died on the mountain. And as Everest continues to call out to the fearless adventurers among us, still more will pay the ultimate price on their way to the roof of the world.